I always thought doing the right thing and working hard would pay off in a good way in the end. But sometimes your hard work just becomes a giant payday for someone who knows exactly how to wait. My name is George. I am 69 years old, and I spent 40 years sweeping the floors of a Kentucky high school to build a secret pile of money that my young wife took exactly 3 years to steal from me. When you spend your whole life cleaning up the trash that other people leave behind, you never expect your own quiet life to turn into the biggest mess of all. For 4 long decades, I wore a faded blue work shirt and pushed a wide, heavy dust mop down the long halls of Bowling Green High. The teenagers ran past me every single day, yelling and laughing, never knowing that the quiet old man picking up their candy wrappers was slowly building a mountain of money. I lived a very simple and strict life, going home every night to a small brick house that I paid off when I was still a young man. I drove an old truck with a heater that barely worked. I cooked my own simple dinners of soup and bread, and I put every single extra dollar I earned into safe bank accounts. Watching my savings grow on those paper statements sent in the mail was my only real comfort in the world. It was the only proof I had that my quiet, lonely life actually meant something important. I told myself I was building a thick wall of money to keep me safe from the hard parts of the world. But a wall built in total silence just traps you inside with your own loneliness, and you only feel how heavy that quiet is when the daily work finally stops. The day I retired, the teachers gave me a cheap store cake and a piece of paper with my name on it, and then I walked out into the bright afternoon sun with absolutely nowhere to go. The silence in my empty house was so loud it actually made my ears ring from morning until late at night. I had all the money I would ever need to live safely, but I had nobody to eat dinner with, nobody to ask about my day, and nobody to care if I even woke up the next morning. That crushing, lonely feeling made me do something I had never done before in my entire life. I went to a travel office in town, pointed at a picture of bright blue ocean water on the wall, and bought a ticket to Tula, Mexico. I had barely ever left the state of Kentucky, and stepping off the airplane into the hot, sticky air felt like landing on another planet completely. I walked the white beaches for days, feeling the warm salt water on my bare feet, amazed by how much of my life I had wasted breathing in floor wax instead of fresh ocean air. I knew I looked totally out of place, just an old man with a bad sunburn, heavy walking shoes standing in a huge crowd of young, happy people. But on my fortnight, I walked into a small, quiet restaurant far away from the loud music, and that is exactly where my old safe life ended. She was moving through the busy tables with a bright, easy smile that seemed to make the whole dark room feel warmer and lighter. When she came over to take my order, she did not look at me like I was just an invisible old man taking up a seat. She looked right into my eyes and asked me where I was from with real deep interest. Her name was Maria, and she spoke wonderful English, sitting down right at my table during her short work break to listen to me talk. I found myself telling her things I had not spoken about out loud in years, explaining the quiet rolling hills of Kentucky, the long empty school halls, and the heavy, terrible sadness of having nothing to do all day. I told her I was 29 years old when I first started pushing that school broom, and she laughed a sweet, musical laugh, telling me she was exactly 29 years old right then. Over the next week, we spent every single day together, meeting the exact second she finished working to walk along the water and watch the sun go down. She told me all about her own hard life, working long hours on her feet just to survive in a town built for rich visitors, and her dream of finding a quiet, safe place to finally rest. I truly believed we were just two tired people who got lucky enough to find each other in a giant, busy world. I wanted to give her everything she never had, to take all my hard-earned money and make sure she never had to worry about paying a light bill or buying food ever again. I told her about my savings, not to brag about being rich, but to promise her a safe and easy future, having absolutely no idea I was just showing her the giant prize she would eventually take. By the end of my 2-week trip, I was completely lost in the magic of feeling young and needed again. When we stood at the busy airport getting ready to say goodbye, I could not imagine going back to my empty brick house alone, so I held her hands tight and asked her to marry me. Bringing Maria back to Bowling Green was an act of pure, blind hope ignoring how incredibly different a sunny Mexican beach was from the freezing gray winter of Kentucky. She arrived in the middle of November, and the sky was a dark, permanent gray that made everything look dead. I remember the quick look of shock and deep disappointment on her beautiful face when my old truck pulled up to my small, boring brick house. She hit it fast with a big smile and a tight hug, telling me that home was wherever we were together, and I wanted to believe her so badly that I ignored the cold feeling in my stomach. We started the long, hard process of getting her a visa and a green card so she could stay in the United States forever without hiding. It was a giant mountain of confusing paperwork, background checks, and expensive fees that forced us to prove every single part of our private lives to the government. We hired a very good, expensive lawyer in town to make sure she would not get sent back across the border, and he told us we needed to show the government that our marriage was completely real. He said the immigration officers looked for shared bank accounts in both names on the house papers to prove we were really building a life together as one team. Maria took this advice extremely seriously, turning our small kitchen table into an office filled with folders and bank papers, telling me over and over that we had to follow the rules perfectly so we would not be pulled apart. I was so terrified of losing her and going back to being alone that I gladly walked into my local bank and put her name on every single account I had built over 40 years of sweeping. I added her name to the house papers, handing over the legal keys to my entire life savings because I thought true love meant having absolutely no secrets. I told myself she just wanted to feel safe in a new country, never once guessing she was just making sure her name was legally tied to every single dollar I had ever made. The next 3 years slowly turned the fun, loving woman I met in Mexico into a quiet, serious person who ran my life like a cold business. We got her first temporary green card after a year, which meant we had to stay married and living together for 2 more years before she could get her permanent card to stay forever. During that long waiting time, everything in our house changed in very small ways. She was the one who checked the mail every single day. Standing by the road waiting for the truck, she was the one who paid all the bills, and she made sure we went to neighborhood parties just enough to look like a normal, happy couple to everyone watching. She started taking weekend trips to visit new friends in other states, telling me she felt trapped and lonely in Kentucky and needed to be around people her own age to stay happy. I always paid for her airplane tickets without asking any hard questions, sitting alone in my quiet living room while she was gone, telling myself this is just what happens when people get used to being married and the fun wears off. We took hundreds of pictures during those 3 years, smiling huge smiles by the Christmas tree and waving at the camera in the park. But I know now those pictures were never for a family photo book. They were just cold proof, carefully collected for a giant folder she was building for the government to show them a flawless, perfect American marriage. When the time finally came for our big interview with the government to get her permanent card, she put on the greatest show I have ever seen in my entire life. She held my hand tight across the desk, looked at the stern officer with real tears in her eyes, and talked about how much she loved our quiet life and how I had saved her from a hard, dangerous world. The bright morning her final green card arrived in the mail, giving her 10 full years of total freedom in the United States, we went out to a nice steak dinner to celebrate the end of our worry. She raised a glass of wine to me, smiling brighter than she had in 3 whole years, and told me our real life together was finally about to start tomorrow. I went to sleep that night feeling a deep, heavy peace, thinking the hard part was finally over and we could just relax and be happy together until I died. But when I woke up the next morning and reached across the bed, the sheets were completely cold and flat. I called out her name as I walked down the hall, the old terrible silence of the house pressing down on my chest again like a heavy weight. I found her bedroom closet completely empty of clothes, her big suitcases gone, and the bathroom counter wiped clean of every single thing she owned. Sitting right in the middle of the kitchen counter was a thick stack of white papers from a lawyer I did not know, telling me she had filed for divorce and was legally taking exactly half of everything we owned. I stood there staring at the black ink, feeling like the wood floor had fallen out from under my shoes as I realized I was never a real husband to her at all. That was just a job, an old, foolish man who hired her for a 3-year contract, and her final paycheck was half of the money I'd spent 40 years pushing a broom to save. The law did not care about my broken heart or my tears. Because I put her name on the bank accounts to show I loved her, she legally owned half of it all. She walked out of the courtroom a rich, safe citizen, and I walked back into my empty, quiet house with half my money gone and a permanent bleeding hole in my chest. I thought I was saving a beautiful soul from a hard life, but I was just the best financial deal she ever made. The poorest a man can ever possibly be is when he fondly realizes his own desperate need to be loved is exactly what destroyed him. The first few days after she walked out the door felt like living completely underwater, where every single sound was muffled and simply moving from the bed to the kitchen took a terrible amount of physical effort. I did not leave the house for an entire week, mostly because I was far too deeply embarrassed to look any of my neighbors in the eye. These were the exact same people who had come over to our backyard for summer barbecues. The same people who had smiled and brought us food while Maria played the part of the perfect, happy new wife standing right by my side. I knew that the second I walked out to the end of the driveway to check the mail, they would see the heavy truth written all over my tired old face. I spent hours just sitting in the exact center of the living room, staring blindly at the empty spaces on the walls where she had carefully taken down the framed pictures of us together. She did not take those pictures because she wanted to keep the happy memories. She took them because she needed the physical proof of our long marriage for her final government folder. I kept walking back down the hallway into the master bedroom just to look at her empty closet, almost expecting her colorful dresses to magically appear hanging there again. But all that remained was the faint, lingering smell of her expensive perfume, and a collection of empty wire hangers pushed all the way to one side. The silence in my house was no longer just the normal quiet of an empty building. It was a heavy, accusing silence that constantly reminded me of my own massive foolishness. I had willingly traded the peaceful, safe quiet of my old life for a few years of fake happiness, and now I was left with a cold silence that felt like a permanent daily punishment. I finally forced myself to put on my heavy winter coat and drive my old truck across town to the lawyer's office, carrying the thick stack of divorce papers she had left sitting right in the middle of the kitchen island. I remember that drive felt incredibly long, the familiar streets of Bowling Green looking completely foreign and strange to me now that my entire world had been turned completely upside down. When I sat down in the heavy leather chair across from my attorney, a man I had known and trusted for over 20 years, I could barely force the words out of my dry mouth. I slid the crisp white papers across his huge wooden desk, feeling exactly like a little boy who had made a terrible mistake and was just waiting to be yelled at by an adult. He put on his reading glasses, read through the first few pages with a completely flat and professional expression, and then let out a long, heavy sigh that made my stomach drop all the way to the floor. He explained to me in very slow, simple words that Kentucky is a state that divides marital property evenly, which meant that anything we earned or shared during the time we were married legally belonged to both of us equally. I tried to interrupt him, waving my hands and explaining that I had earned all that money by pushing a heavy broom for 40 long years before I even knew she existed on this earth. I told him the money was mine, the brick house was mine, and I had only put her name on the bank accounts to prove to the government that I loved her so she could get her green card to stay here. He looked at me with a deep, sad pity in his tired eyes and told me that the law does not care why I put her name on those accounts. The law only cares that her name is legally printed on the bank paper. He told me that by adding her to my lifetime of hard savings, I had legally transformed my personal private money into a shared marital asset, and she was entirely within her rights to demand exactly half of every single penny. I sat back in that quiet office and felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck as the crushing reality of what I had actually done finally set into my brain. I had basically handed a perfect stranger the keys to the giant bank vault I had spent my entire adult life carefully building, all because I was simply too terrified of being alone in my old age. The lawyer told me we could try to fight it in court. We could try to stand before a judge and prove that she had married me strictly for the money and the green card, but it would take years and cost me tens of thousands of dollars in expensive legal fees. And even if we did fight, he gently warned me that judges almost always look at the black and white ink on the bank statements, not the broken heart of an old man who made a very bad choice. I realized right then that Maria had planned this exact conversation. She had known exactly what the state laws were, and she had spent 3 long years making sure every single piece of paper was perfectly aligned in her favor. She was playing a high-stakes, brilliant game of chess while I was just happily playing house, and she had silently checkmated me before I even knew the game had officially started. I drove home that quiet afternoon feeling like a ghost haunting my own life, invisible and completely powerless. I walked into the kitchen and started opening the wooden cabinets, looking at the coffee cups we bought together, the plates we ate dinner off of, realizing that every single object in the house was a reminder of the giant lie I had been living. I had to sit down at the table, pull out a pen, and start doing a terrible math, adding up exactly how much money she was going to legally strip away from my accounts. I looked at the retirement statements I used to be so incredibly proud of, the high numbers that used to make me feel safe and powerful, and I physically watched them get cut right in half before my eyes. I had planned to spend my golden years traveling a little bit, maybe buying a small piece of green land out in the country where I could sit on a porch and listen to the birds sing in the morning. Now, I was going to have to carefully count every single dollar I spent at the grocery store just to make sure I could pay the heating bill through the long, freezing winter. I had to call a real estate agent the very next morning to talk about selling the house. The exact same brick house I had paid off 30 years ago through hard physical labor and strict daily discipline. The agent walked through the rooms with a notebook, pointing out things that needed to be fixed before we could put a for sale sign in the front yard, and I just nodded my head, feeling completely disconnected from my own body. I was watching my entire life be taken apart piece by piece, sold off to strangers just so I could afford to pay off the woman who had used me as a stepping stone to a much better life. I thought back to all those years I spent working in the hot school, the quiet pride I took in doing a simple, boring job perfectly, the way I saved my money when other men my age were buying fancy cars and taking expensive, fun vacations. I thought I was being incredibly smart, sacrificing my young years so that my old age would be completely easy and comfortable. I used to look at people who made bad financial decisions and quietly judge them, thinking they were just foolish and lacked basic self-control. Now I was the biggest fool of them all, a man who had traded 40 years of sweat and sacrifice for 3 years of fake smiles and polite conversation. I realized that keeping yourself completely isolated from the rest of the world does not make you strong. It actually makes you incredibly weak and vulnerable. When you starve a man of water for long enough, he will happily drink pure poison if you put it in a pretty glass and tell him it is sweet. Maria knew exactly how thirsty I was for a kind word and a warm touch, and she used that desperate, quiet thirst to carefully drain me dry. The day I actually had to go to the courthouse to finish the divorce was the coldest morning of the entire year. I walked up the heavy stone steps of the building feeling like an old, tired dog walking to the vet, knowing exactly what was going to happen but completely unable to stop it. The inside of the courthouse smelled like old paper and strong floor cleaner, a smell I knew perfectly from 40 years of working in a school. But this time, I was not the invisible man holding the mop. I was just another broken person waiting in a long line to have a judge officially tear my life completely apart. My lawyer met me in the hallway wearing a thick winter coat, holding a brown folder that contained the exact numbers of my total financial ruin, and he simply patted my shoulder without saying a single word. He knew there was absolutely nothing left to say to make me feel better, because the law is just a cold, blind machine that eats paper and spits out rules. I sat on a hard wooden bench outside the courtroom doors, watching other couples walk by looking angry or sad, realizing that this giant building was basically a factory that processed human misery all day long. I tried to calm my racing heart by taking deep breaths, but the air felt thin and freezing, and my hands would not stop shaking no matter how hard I pressed them against my knees. I had spent my entire life trying to be a good, honest man who followed the rules and never caused trouble for anyone. But the legal system did not care about my good heart. It only cared that my legal name was printed next to her legal name on the bank accounts holding all my hard-earned money. When they finally called our names, I walked through the heavy wooden doors and saw Maria sitting at a long wooden table with her expensive lawyer. It was the very first time I had seen her since she left that stack of divorce papers on my kitchen counter, and my breath actually caught in my throat when I looked at her face. She was not the sweet, smiling girl in the bright dresses walking barefoot on the warm Mexican beach, and she was not the quiet, helpful wife wearing sweatpants in my boring suburban kitchen. She was wearing a sharp, dark gray business suit with her hair pulled back tightly, looking exactly like a professional banker who was about to close a very important financial deal. She did not look at me with anger, she did not look at me with guilt, and she did not look at me with any sadness at all. She simply looked straight ahead at the judge with a completely blank, empty face, treating me like I was just a minor problem standing in the way of her giant payday. I wanted to scream at her. I wanted to ask her how she could sleep at night knowing she was stealing a dusty old man's entire life savings, but I just sat down quietly next to my lawyer like a tired child. Seeing her look so completely cold and untouched by my terrible pain was actually worse than losing the money itself. It finally proved to me that the love I felt for those 3 years was nothing but a complete one-sided fantasy that I'd paid for with my own sweat. The judge was a tired older man who looked like he had seen 1,000 broken marriages just exactly like mine, and he did not waste any time getting to the final math. He read through the papers quickly, asking a few short questions that my lawyer answered in a low, flat voice, completely ignoring the massive tragedy that was happening to my life. I sat there in the quiet room and listened as the judge officially ordered my retirement accounts to be cut exactly down the middle, legally forcing my bank to send half of everything I owned directly to her new account. It took exactly 15 minutes for a man in a black robe to give away 40 years of my early mornings, my sore back, and my blistered hands to a woman who had never swept a single floor in her entire life. When the judge hit his heavy wooden hammer on the desk, the loud crack echoed in the big room like a gunshot, officially ending the short, fake marriage that had completely destroyed my future. Maria stood up immediately, shook her lawyer's hand with a small, polite smile, and turned to walk right down the middle aisle without ever turning her head to look at me. I watched her walk out the back doors into the bright morning light, a rich, legally protected resident of the United States who had just pulled off the perfect legal robbery. She was totally free to start her real life now, paid in full by my foolishness, while I was left sitting in a hard wooden chair trying to figure out how I was going to survive the winter. Moving out of the brick house I'd owned for 3 decades was the most physically and mentally exhausting thing I have ever had to do in my long life. Because I had to give her half the total value of everything we owned, I was forced to sell the house to a nice young couple who were so excited to start their new family in my old rooms. I spent weeks packing my clothes and my few simple dishes into brown cardboard boxes, working late into the night while the quiet, empty house mocked me from every single corner. I threw away all the things we had bought together, the soft towels, the pretty coffee cups, the small decorations she had picked out to make the house look like a real home for her government pictures. Every time I taped a box shut, I felt like I was sealing away a piece of my own foolish pride, packing up the heavy pieces of a broken dream that I should never have believed in the first place. I rented a very small, cheap apartment on the bad side of town, a place with thin walls where I could hear the neighbors yelling and the loud cars driving by all night long. I had to carry my boxes up 2 flights of stairs by myself, my old knees popping and aching with every single step, sweating and breathing hard into cold air. Sitting alone on the edge of a cheap mattress in that dark, ugly apartment, eating a cold sandwich for dinner, I realized I had fallen all the way back to the very bottom of the hill I had spent my whole life climbing. The worst part of this entire nightmare was not just the terrible living conditions or the cold food. It was the crushing realization that I was going to have to go back to work. I'd done the math 100 times on my small kitchen table, counting every single dollar I had left, and the numbers always told me the exact same terrifying truth. Half of my savings is simply not enough to pay for my rent, my food, and my expensive heart medicine for the rest of my natural life. I had to swallow every single ounce of my pride, iron my best faded shirt, and drive around town asking for part-time cleaning jobs from people who were half my age. I ended up taking a night shift cleaning a large empty office building, pushing a heavy vacuum cleaner over miles of gray carpet while the rest of the world was safely asleep in their warm beds. Every time my back ached or my feet swelled up inside my shoes, I thought about Maria sitting in a nice warm house somewhere, spending the money I was currently bleeding to replace. The physical pain of the hard work was bad, but the deep, burning anger inside my chest was completely exhausting, eating away at my spirit like battery acid. I was an old man starting over from absolutely nothing, trapped in a tired, broken body, paying the daily physical price for thinking I could just buy a little bit of love to keep me warm. It has been 2 years since that cold morning in the courthouse, and my daily life has settled into a very quiet, very small routine that feels perfectly matched to the shrinking size of my world. I wake up in my dark apartment. Just as the sun is starting to go down, I put on a cheap gray work uniform that scratches the back of my neck, and I drive to a massive glass office building on the very edge of town. For 8 hours every single night, I push a heavy industrial vacuum cleaner across endless floors of gray carpet, emptying hundreds of plastic trash cans filled with crumpled paper and stale coffee cups left behind by people who make more money in a week than I do in an entire year. The hum of the machine is incredibly loud, but it is a steady, predictable noise that actually helps drown out the heavy thoughts that still try to creep into my mind when I am completely alone. My hands are much stiffer now than they were when I swept the high school floors. My knuckles are swollen with arthritis from decades of manual labor, and there are some nights when my knees ache so badly I have to sit down in the dark stairwell just to catch my breath. But I force myself to stand back up and keep moving forward, because the absolute terrifying truth is that if I stop working for even a few weeks, I will not be able to pay the rent for my tiny apartment, and I will have absolutely nowhere else to go. I used to be a man who worked hard because he was building a strong, proud fortress for his future. But now I am just an old, tired man working out of pure, raw survival, trying desperately to keep my head above water until my body finally gives out completely. I do not hate Maria anymore, which is something that usually surprises the very few people who actually know the true story about what happened to me and my missing retirement money. Holding on to that kind of burning, violent anger is simply too exhausting for an old man with a weak heart, and it honestly takes far too much daily energy to constantly wish bad things upon someone who never actually cared about you in the first place. I spent the first year completely consumed by a dark, bitter rage, constantly imagining her spending my hard-earned money on expensive clothes and fancy vacations, feeling my blood pressure rise every single time I saw a couple walking hand in hand down the street. But eventually, the anger just burned itself entirely out, leaving behind a cold, clear understanding of exactly what my role was in my own financial destruction. Maria was just a hungry, ambitious person who saw a completely open door and walked right through it, taking exactly what the state law legally allowed her to take. I was the one who unlocked that door, I was the one who handed her the keys, and I was the one who willingly ignored 100 bright red warning signs because I was too incredibly stubborn to admit I was lonely. She did not use a weapon to rob me, she just used my own desperate, quiet need to feel important to someone, and that is a painful weakness that I have to take full responsibility for carrying inside my chest. I forgave her not because she deserved to be forgiven for lying to my face for 3 years, but because I needed to forgive myself for being foolish enough to believe that a beautiful, vibrant young woman would ever want to spend her best years sitting in a quiet brick house with an aging janitor. The absolute hardest part of this entire journey has been learning how to sit completely alone in a silent room without feeling like the silence is physically crushing me to death. Before I met her, the quiet in my house was a heavy, terrifying thing that drove me thousands of miles away to a crowded beach just to hear another human voice. Now the quiet in my small apartment is just a completely neutral fact of my daily existence, something I have slowly learned to accept without trying to instantly fill it up with artificial noise or fake company. I drink my cheap coffee in the morning and look out the small window at the traffic passing by, and I realize that the crushing loneliness I was so desperately running away from was actually much safer than the dangerous company I decided to keep. I thought I was buying a permanent shield against the reality of growing old, a beautiful distraction that would make me forget about my gray hair and my tired bones. But you cannot buy your way out of the fundamental human condition, and you certainly cannot purchase genuine love with a joint checking account and a piece of legal paper. True companionship is built over decades of shared struggles, honest conversations, and mutual respect, not over a 2-week vacation in a tropical paradise and a frantic rush to fill out immigration paperwork. I traded the slow, honest, boring reality of my actual life for a very expensive, fast-moving illusion, and when the bright lights of the illusion finally turned off, I was left standing entirely in the dark. This brings me to the absolute hardest lesson I have had to swallow in my entire 69 years on this earth. And it is the exact reason I am sitting here telling you this deeply embarrassing, painful story today. I know there are other men out there watching this right now, men who have worked incredibly hard their whole lives, built a nice little nest egg, and are suddenly staring down the barrel of a very quiet, very empty retirement. You might be sitting in your favorite armchair right now, looking at the empty space on the couch next to you, thinking that you would gladly trade every single dollar in your bank account just to have someone smile at you and ask you how your day went. I am telling you right now, as a man who actually made that exact trade, that the price of that fake smile is far higher than you could ever possibly calculate. There are people in this world who are absolute experts at identifying that deep, quiet thirst inside you, and they will gladly pour you a glass of water today if it means they legally own your entire well tomorrow. Do not let the terrifying fear of growing old alone make you completely abandon the common sense that kept you safe your entire life. Do not look at a younger, vibrant person who suddenly shows an intense interest in your quiet, boring life and convince yourself that it is some kind of magical, late-in-life miracle. Protect the things you have built with your own sweat and your own sore back, because when the final paperwork is signed and the green card arrives in the mail, the law will not care that your heart was in the right place. I am going to finish my cold cup of coffee now, put on my heavy winter coat, and drive my old car back to the giant glass building to clean up the messes that other people have left behind. I will push that heavy vacuum cleaner back and forth across the gray carpet until my shoulders burn and my feet go completely numb. And I will do it again tomorrow, and the next day, and the day after that. I will probably die working in that empty building, and the small amount of money I have left will barely be enough to pay for a simple, quiet burial. But as I walk through those empty hallways tonight, I will at least know exactly who I am, and exactly what I have done, without any beautiful lies or comfortable illusions left to cloud my tired mind. I have paid for my terrible mistakes with every single thing I own, and I have nothing left to hide from the world or from myself. I just hope that by standing here and showing you the massive bleeding hole where my life savings used to be, I can stop just one other lonely man from making the exact same devastating trade. Be incredibly careful with your heart. Be fiercely protective of your hard work, and never ever believe that you can buy the cure for your own loneliness. There is a very strange, quiet kind of freedom that comes to a man when the absolute worst thing he could possibly imagine finally happens, and he survives it. For 40 years, I lived in a state of constant, quiet anxiety about losing my savings, checking the locks on my doors, watching the stock market numbers go up and down in the evening news, and hoarding every single penny because I was terrified of ending up poor in my old age. Now that my greatest fear has actually come true, now that the bank accounts are completely gutted and my peaceful retirement is entirely gone, that heavy anxiety has simply vanished into the thin winter air. I no longer rush to the mailbox hoping for good news. I no longer worry about the fluctuating interest rates on my retirement accounts. And I no longer lie awake at night wondering if I have saved enough money to be safe. The worst has already happened. The thief has already come and gone with the blessing of the state court, and I am still waking up every single morning with air in my lungs. I walk through the grocery store aisles with my small hand basket, carefully looking at the price tags and the canned soup and the cheap bread, and I feel a strange sense of total clarity that I never had when I was sitting on a mountain of cash. When you have absolutely nothing left to protect, You suddenly realize how much of your life was wasted just standing guard over a pile of paper that could be wiped out by a single signature on a divorce decree. Before I drive to the office building for my night shift, I usually spend an hour sitting on a wooden bench in the small park near the center of town, just watching the people of Bowling Green go about their daily lives. Lately, I have started noticing things that I was completely blind to before Maria walked into my life and tore it apart. I see older men walking out of the jewelry stores or the expensive restaurants, their shoulders hunched with age, holding the hands of women who are young enough to be their daughters. I look at the faces of those men, the desperate, hopeful pride glowing in their tired eyes, the way they puff out their chests and try to walk a little faster to keep up with the vibrant energy of the women beside them. And then I look at the women, at the polite, practiced smiles frozen on their faces, the way their eyes constantly scan the street, the cold, calculating patience hiding just behind their beautiful makeup. I know exactly what is happening in those relationships, because I lived every single second of that exact same play. I know the expensive dinners, the carefully planned trips, the slow transfer of financial power disguised as absolute trust and romantic partnership. I want to stand up from my wooden bench, walk over to those men, grab them by the shoulders, and shake them until they wake up from the dangerous dream they are living. But I stay seated, because I know that a man who is dying of thirst will absolutely refuse to believe that the glass of water you are trying to take away from him is filled with poison. You cannot talk a lonely man out of his own illusion. He has to drink the entire glass and feel the poison burn his own throat before he finally understands the terrible mistake he has made. I often wonder what Maria is doing right now at this exact moment, but I do not wonder about it with any anger or desire for revenge. I imagine she is living in a much warmer city, maybe somewhere in Florida or Texas, sitting in a nice house that my 40 years of sweeping floors paid for in full. She probably has a new circle of friends who think she is a brilliant, successful immigrant who came to America and built a wonderful life entirely from scratch. She will never tell anyone the actual truth about the quiet janitor in Kentucky who gave her the legal right to completely empty his life savings. She will tell herself she earned that money by putting up with a boring old man for 3 long years, that it was a fair trade for her youth and her time, and the law of this country completely agrees with her. But what she does not understand and what the legal system refuses to acknowledge is that she did not just steal my money. She stole the final chapter of a hard-working life. She stole the peaceful rest I earned by sacrificing my own youth, and she destroyed my fundamental ability to ever trust another human being again. She took the quiet dignity of my old age and replaced it with a heavy, humiliating burden that I have to carry on my sore back until the day I am finally put into the ground. But I also know that money stolen through deception never buys true peace. And while I may be pushing a heavy vacuum cleaner in the middle of the night, I can at least look at myself in the mirror without seeing a liar staring back. If you are listening to my story right now, and you've spent your life working hard, keeping your head down, and quietly building a safe financial wall for your golden years, I need you to listen to me with your entire heart. Do not mistake the heavy silence of a lonely house for a problem that needs to be fixed by purchasing the affection of someone who has not earned your trust. The quiet of your empty living room might feel incredibly heavy some nights. It might make your chest ache and your mind wander to dark places. But I promise you that silence is your absolute greatest protector. True love in your later years does not arrive in a sudden, blinding flash of passion on a tropical beach, and it certainly does not demand access to your bank accounts to prove that it is real. If someone truly loves you, they will love the tired, worn-out version of you, sitting on the porch with absolutely nothing to offer but your time and your honest stories. They will not care about the size of your retirement account or the deed to your brick house, and they will never ask you to legally tie your life's work to their name just to make them feel secure. Protect your peace, protect the money you broke your back to save, and learn to find comfort in the quiet, simple reality of the life you have already built. I am going to go to work now. I am going to put on my uniform, and I am going to spend another night cleaning up the dirt of the world. It is a hard, tiring life, but it is finally an honest one, and I will gladly take the heavy ache in my bones over the absolute devastation of a broken heart.